The morning sun shone through the crystal dome of Galactic Academy as students filled the corridors. Today was different from other days because everyone was talking about the new student who would join their class. The new student was coming from a planet called Earth, and nobody knew much about this place. Jin Woo walked through the hallways with his usual confident stride. He was tall and strong with 4 bright blue eyes and skin that looked like living crystal. His family owned many mining companies across different star systems, which made him very rich and powerful. Other students always moved out of his way when they saw him coming because they knew better than to make him angry. The Vorthan boy had been at Galactic Academy for 3 years now, and he had never met anyone who could challenge him. His people were known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors and successful business owners. They were proud and strong, and they did not like to be told what to do by anyone, especially by beings from lesser worlds. When Jin Woo reached the advanced physics classroom, he saw his friends Tai Min and Hyun Soo already sitting in their usual seats near the back. They were also Vorthans from noble families, and they followed Jin Woo everywhere he went. The 3 of them had formed a group that most other students feared and respected. Professor Kyle stood at the front of the classroom preparing his lesson materials. He was an old Zenthari with gray skin and wise yellow eyes who had taught at the Academy for many decades. The professor had served in the Galactic Defense Force before becoming a teacher, so he knew about many different alien species and their capabilities. As more students entered the classroom, the excitement in the air grew stronger. Everyone wanted to see what this human would look like and whether the stories they had heard were true. Some students whispered that humans came from something called a death world, which sounded very scary and dangerous to most of them. The classroom held about 30 students from 12 different species. There were the tall, crystalline Vorthans, like Jin Woo and his friends. There were small, furry creatures called Kelpians, who were very good at mathematics. There were the plant-like Verdani, who could change colors based on their emotions. There were also several other species that had joined the galactic community in recent years. When the door opened again, everyone turned to look at who was entering. Professor Kale smiled and gestured toward the doorway where a figure appeared that made the entire room fall silent. The human student walked in, and she looked nothing like what anyone had expected to see. Mira was her name, and she appeared to be very young compared to most of the other students. She was much shorter than Jin Woo, standing at only about 5.5 feet tall. Her skin was smooth and pale without any natural armor or protective scales. Her hair was black and shiny, and it moved in a way that seemed almost alive. What struck everyone the most were her eyes. They were completely round and dark brown, which was very different from the compound eyes or multicolored eyes that most other species had. Her eyes seemed to take in everything around her, but she did not stare at anyone in particular. She moved very quietly across the room as if she was trying not to disturb anyone. Professor Kale cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. Class, please welcome Mira from Earth. I trust you will all make her feel welcome here at our academy. She has traveled very far to study with us, and she comes with excellent recommendations from her home planet educational system. Mira smiled politely and nodded to the class. Her voice was soft when she spoke. Thank you, Professor Kale. I am very excited to be here, and I look forward to learning with everyone. She moved to an empty seat in the middle of the classroom and sat down carefully, placing her study materials on the desk in front of her. Jin Woo watched her with growing irritation. She looked so weak and fragile that he could not understand how she had been accepted into such a prestigious academy. The advanced physics class was meant for the best and brightest students from across the galaxy. How could someone from an unknown primitive world possibly belong here with them? During the lesson, Professor Kale began discussing gravity manipulation and the mathematics involved in creating artificial gravity fields. This was very complex, material that even the smartest students struggled to understand completely. The equations were long and difficult, and required years of study to master properly. To Jinwoo's surprise, Mira raised her hand several times during the lesson. When Professor Kale called on her, she answered the questions correctly and clearly. Her explanations showed that she understood not just the basic concepts, but also some of the more advanced applications that they had not even covered yet. How is this possible? Jinwoo thought to himself. She comes from some backwater planet that probably does not even have space travel, yet she understands advanced physics better than students who have been studying it for years. There must be some mistake, or maybe she is cheating somehow. The other students began to notice Mira's knowledge as well. Some of them looked impressed while others seemed suspicious. A few students whispered to each other, wondering how someone from such a primitive world could know so much about advanced scientific concepts. When the class ended, students began to file out of the room talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Mira gathered her materials slowly and carefully, as if she was not in any hurry to leave. Jinwoo decided that this was the perfect opportunity to find out more about this strange human girl. He waited until most of the other students had left before approaching Mira's desk. His crystalline face wore an expression of barely controlled anger as he looked down at her. "Listen, Death Worlder," he said, using the term like an insult. "I do not know what kind of special treatment you received to get into this academy, but this is a school for real beings, with real intelligence." Mira looked up at him calmly without any fear or anger showing in her dark eyes. "I am just here to learn," she said quietly. "I do not want any trouble with anyone." Her voice remained steady and polite, even though Jinwoo was clearly trying to intimidate her with his size and aggressive posture. Jinwoo laughed harshly at her response. The sound echoed off the metal walls of the empty classroom. Trouble was exactly what he planned to give her. "Maybe you should go back to whatever mud pit you crawled out of before you embarrass yourself further. This academy is for superior beings, not primitive creatures who probably just learned how to make fire." Mira continued to pack her materials without responding to his insults. Her calm demeanor only made Jinwoo more angry because he was used to other students cowering before him, or at least showing some sign of fear. This human girl acted as if his threats meant nothing to her, which was unacceptable. As Mira stood to leave, Jinwoo stepped closer to block her path. "You will show me proper respect, human, or you will regret coming to this academy. I am Jinwoo of the House of Takvar, and my family controls more wealth and power than your entire pathetic planet. You would be wise to remember that." Mira looked at him for a long moment with those strange, round eyes. Something flickered in her gaze for just an instant, but it was gone so quickly that Jinwoo was not sure he had really seen it. Then she stepped around him and walked toward the door. "I will remember," she said softly before disappearing into the corridor. Jinwoo stood alone in the empty classroom, feeling frustrated and confused. No one had ever dismissed him so casually before. This human girl clearly did not understand her place in the academy's social structure. He would have to teach her proper respect for her betters, and he looked forward to the opportunity. Over the next 2 weeks, Jinwoo made it his personal mission to make Mira's life at the academy as difficult as possible. Every day he found new ways to bother her and show the other students that she did not belong among them. He would arrive at the classroom early and move her study materials to different seats so she would have trouble finding them. During lectures, Jinwoo would make loud comments about primitive species whenever Mira answered questions correctly. He would cough loudly or drop his books whenever she was speaking to disrupt her concentration. The crystalline boy took great pleasure in watching her struggle to maintain her composure while he made her academic life miserable. Mira endured all of his harassment with remarkable patience. She never raised her voice or complained to the professors about Jinwoo's behavior. When he knocked her books off her desk, she would simply pick them up without saying anything. When he made insulting comments, she would ignore him completely, as if he was not even there. Her calm response to his bullying only made Jinwoo more determined to break her spirit. In Vorthan culture, strength and dominance were everything, and Mira's refusal to fight back felt like mockery to him. How dare this weak human girl act as if his threats and insults meant nothing to her? She needed to learn her proper place in the Academy's social order. Jinwoo began recruiting other students to help him isolate Mira from the rest of the class. He convinced his friends Taemin and Hyun-soo to exclude her from group projects whenever possible. When professors assigned team exercises, the three Vorthons would quickly form groups with other students, leaving Mira to work alone or with whoever was left. The campaign of exclusion was very effective because most students were afraid to stand up to Jinwoo and his friends. The Vorthons came from powerful families with connections throughout the galactic government and military. Students who opposed them might find their own academic careers or family businesses suffering mysterious problems later on. Despite being isolated from most social groups, Mira continued to excel in her classes. Her test scores were consistently among the highest in every subject, and her project work showed a level of creativity and insight that impressed even the most demanding professors. This academic success only fueled Jinwoo's anger because it proved that she truly belonged at the academy. During lunch periods, Jinwoo would deliberately sit at tables near Mira so he could continue his psychological warfare. He would tell loud stories about how his people had conquered weaker species throughout the galaxy. He described in graphic detail how Vorthon mining operations had strip-mined entire worlds, reducing once proud civilizations to scattered refugees. The stories were meant to intimidate Mira and remind her that humans were just another primitive species that could be crushed if they became too troublesome. Jinwoo would watch her face carefully while he spoke, looking for signs of fear or distress, but her expression remained neutral and unreadable throughout his presentations. Sometimes, Jinwoo thought he saw something flicker in Mira's dark eyes when he told his most violent stories. There would be a brief moment when her gaze would sharpen and her posture would change slightly as if she was preparing for something. But these moments passed so quickly that he convinced himself he was imagining things. The other students began to take sides in the ongoing conflict between Jinwoo and Mira. Some supported the Vorthon boy because they feared his family's power, or because they genuinely believed that humans were inferior beings who did not deserve to study at such a prestigious institution. Others felt sympathy for Mira but were too afraid to help her openly. A few brave students tried to include Mira in their study groups or sit with her during meals, but Jinwoo quickly put a stop to these attempts at friendship. He would confront anyone who showed kindness to the human girl and make it clear that such behavior would result in serious consequences for them and their families. The breaking point came during an orbital mechanics simulation exercise. Students were required to pilot virtual spacecraft through complex asteroid fields while calculating gravitational forces and trajectory adjustments in real time. The exercise was designed to test both mathematical knowledge and spatial reasoning abilities under pressure. Most students struggled with the simulation because it required them to think quickly and adapt to constantly changing conditions. The BO. Asteroid fields were randomly generated, so no two runs were exactly alike. Students had to rely on their instincts and training rather than memorized solutions to succeed. When Mira's turn came, she completed the simulation course in record time. Her movements were smooth and precise as she guided her virtual spacecraft through the dangerous asteroid field. She seemed to anticipate the gravitational effects before the computer could calculate them, and her ship never came close to colliding with any obstacles. Professor Kale was clearly impressed by her performance. Remarkable spatial awareness, he commented as the class watched Mira's replay on the main screen. Your species must have excellent natural coordination and reflexes. These are exactly the kinds of skills we look for in advanced pilot candidates. Mira smiled politely at the praise, but Jinwoo could see a flash of pride in her eyes. That moment of satisfaction was more than he could tolerate. This primitive human girl was not only succeeding at the academy, but she was actually better than him at subjects he had studied for years. The humiliation was unbearable. After the class ended, Jinwoo followed Mira as she made her way to the practice rooms, where students often went to study alone. The corridors in this section of the academy were usually empty during evening meal periods, which made it the perfect place for a private conversation without any witnesses. The practice rooms were soundproofed chambers designed for students to work on projects that required concentration or might disturb others. Each room contained advanced computer terminals and holographic display systems that could simulate almost any environment or scenario needed for academic work. Myra entered one of the smaller practice rooms and began setting up her study materials on the central table. She moved with the same quiet efficiency that Jinwoo had noticed on her first day at the academy. Everything she did seemed deliberate and controlled, as if she was always thinking several steps ahead. Jinwoo waited until she was focused on her work before entering the room and sealing the door behind him. The sound of the door locking made Mira look up from her materials, but her expression remained calm and neutral. She did not seem surprised or frightened to find herself alone with him in the isolated chamber. "You think you are so special, do you not?" Jinwoo said as he moved closer to where she was sitting. "Flying through simulations like you own the place and impressing the professors with your primitive instincts. But I know what you really are, human. You are nothing but a weak, soft creature from a worthless world." Mira carefully set down the tablet she had been reading and turned to face him fully. "Please move aside, Jinwoo. I need to return to my dormitory for the evening meal." Her voice was steady and polite, but something had changed in the way she was sitting. She was balanced on the edge of her chair as if she was ready to move quickly, if necessary. Jinwoo stepped directly in front of the door, blocking her only exit from the practice room. His crystalline features were twisted with anger and frustration as he looked down at the small human girl. "Without your little tricks and sympathy from the professors, you would be nothing. You do not belong here among real beings who have earned their place through strength and intelligence." The Vorthan boy was much larger and stronger than Mira, and he intended to use his physical advantages to finally put her in her proper place. He had intimidated countless other students this way, and none of them had ever dared to fight back against him. This human girl would learn to respect her betters even if he had to teach her through fear and pain. "Make me little human!" Jinwoo snarled as he raised his primary arm to grab her. He planned to shove her against the wall hard enough to leave bruises that would remind her of this lesson for days to come. His crystalline hand reached toward her shoulder, intending to demonstrate the vast difference in their physical capabilities. What happened next would change everything. Jinwoo's massive crystalline hand reached toward Mira's shoulder with confident force. He had done this same intimidating grab hundreds of times before with other students, and it always worked perfectly. His superior size and strength made resistance impossible for most beings, and the few who tried to fight back usually ended up with painful injuries that taught them proper respect. But Mira was not like other students, and she was definitely not helpless. The moment Jinwoo's hand moved toward her, Mira's entire body shifted into motion with impossible speed and precision. She flowed around his reaching arm like water moving around a stone. Her movements were so smooth and controlled that for a split second, Jinwoo thought she had simply disappeared from in front of him. Before the Vorthan boy could understand what was happening, Mira had stepped inside his reach and grabbed his extended wrist with both of her small hands. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her fingers found pressure points on his arm that he did not even know existed. Sharp pain shot through his crystalline limb as she applied leverage in ways that his anatomy was never designed to handle. In one fluid motion, Mira pivoted on her left foot and drove her right elbow upward with devastating accuracy. The strike caught Jinwoo directly in his primary sensory cluster, which was located just below his main breathing apparatus. For Vorthans, this area was extremely sensitive and vulnerable, despite being protected by several layers of natural armor. The impact felt like being struck by a mining laser. Jin Woo's vision exploded into bright flashes of light and color as pain signals flooded his nervous system. His 4 eyes watered uncontrollably, and his breathing became labored and painful. He had never experienced anything like this level of agony in his entire life. But Mira was not finished with her lesson. While Jin Woo was still reeling from the elbow strike, Mira shifted her grip on his wrist and used his own momentum against him. She stepped to the side and pulled downward while pushing upward with her shoulder. The combined forces created a perfect throwing technique that sent 8 feet of crystalline warrior sailing through the air. Jin Woo crashed into the practice room wall with tremendous force. The reinforced polymer surface was designed to withstand impacts from heavy equipment, but even it cracked under the violence of his collision. The sound echoed through the soundproofed chamber like thunder breaking across a mountaintop. The Vorthan boy slid down the wall, leaving a spiderweb pattern of damage behind him. His crystalline exoskeleton rang like a bell from the impact, and several of his protective plates had developed stress fractures. He struggled to push himself up from the floor, but his body was not responding properly to his commands. As Jin Woo fought to regain his footing, Mira was already moving toward him. Again, there was no wasted motion in her approach, and no hesitation in her actions. She moved like a natural predator that had identified its target and was closing in for the final strike. Her dark eyes were focused and alert, but showed no anger or hatred, only cold calculation. Jin Woo managed to raise his head just in time to see Mira's fist coming toward his face. The punch was perfectly executed with her entire body weight behind the blow. Her technique was flawless, from the positioning of her feet, to the rotation of her hips, to the extension of her arm. Every element worked together to deliver maximum force to the target. The impact was devastating beyond anything Jin Woo could have imagined. Mira's knuckles connected with his facial structure at exactly the right angle to cause catastrophic damage. The sound was like breaking glass amplified through a crystal canyon. Sharp, crystalline fragments scattered across the floor like deadly confetti as his protective plating shattered completely. Jin Woo's secondary eyes went dark immediately as the trauma spread through his optical systems. His primary eyes swelled, shut from the massive tissue damage and internal bleeding. Strange blue fluid that served as Vorthan blood flowed freely from multiple fractures in his facial structure. The proud features that had intimidated so many students were now a ruined mess of broken crystal and torn flesh. The entire encounter had lasted exactly 3 seconds. Mira stood over Jin Woo's writhing form, breathing steadily and calmly as if she had just completed a routine exercise. There was no sign of fatigue or stress in her posture, and her study materials were still neatly arranged on the table where she had left them. She looked down at the broken Vorthan with something that might have been pity. "You should probably get to the medical bay," Jin Woo Mira said in the same soft, polite voice she always used in class. "Those fractures look quite serious, and you will need immediate treatment to prevent permanent damage." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing a minor academic problem rather than life-threatening injuries. Jin Woo tried to respond, but only managed to produce keening sounds of pain and shock. The proud warrior who had terrorized countless students now looked like a broken toy that had been thrown against a wall by an angry child. His crystalline armor was cracked and leaking, and his face was barely recognizable as belonging to a sentient being. Mira gathered her study materials with the same careful precision she always displayed. She checked to make sure nothing had been damaged during the brief confrontation and organized her papers in perfect order. When everything was arranged to her satisfaction, she moved toward the door without looking back at her victim. The door unsealed with a soft hiss as Mira approached. She paused for just a moment in the doorway and glanced back at Jin Woo, who was still struggling to stand upright. "I really do hope you feel better soon," she said, with what seemed like genuine concern. "Perhaps next time, you will think more carefully before putting your hands on someone without permission." Then she was gone, leaving Jin Woo alone with his shattered pride and his very real need for emergency medical attention. The practice room fell silent except for the sounds of his labored breathing and the occasional drip of blue blood falling onto the polymer floor. Crystalline fragments crunched under his weight as he tried unsuccessfully to push himself upright. The security cameras had recorded everything, but no one would review the footage until much later. For now, Jin Woo was completely alone with the devastating realization that everything he thought he knew about humans and about his own superiority had been utterly wrong. The small, quiet girl from Earth had just taught him a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As consciousness began to fade from blood loss and trauma, Jin Woo's last coherent thought was a simple one. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance and cruelty. The Death World girl had shown him exactly why humans were not to be underestimated, and the lesson had cost him dearly. Mira walked calmly through the empty corridors toward her dormitory as if nothing unusual had happened. Other students she passed in the hallways greeted her politely, and she responded with her usual friendly smile. None of them suspected that she had just single-handedly destroyed one of the Academy's most feared bullies in less time than it takes to blink. Behind her, Jin Woo continued to bleed on the practice room floor, waiting for someone to find him and get him the medical help he desperately needed. The 3 seconds that had changed everything were already becoming a memory, but the consequences would last much longer than that. The emergency alarm echoed through the academy corridors as medical teams rushed toward the practice room section. A maintenance worker had found Jin Woo unconscious on the floor, surrounded by pools of blue blood and scattered fragments of his own crystalline armor. The injuries were so severe that the first responders initially thought there had been some kind of equipment malfunction or structural collapse. Dr. Theis was the head physician at Galactic Academy's medical center, and she had treated injuries from dozens of different species over her long career. But when they brought Jin Woo into the emergency treatment bay, she had never seen damage quite like this before. The precision of the injuries was remarkable, and clearly not accidental or the result of any kind of equipment failure. Every strike had been calculated for maximum effect while avoiding permanent disability. The elbow blow had damaged his sensory cluster enough to cause tremendous pain, but without destroying his ability to breathe or process basic sensory input. The throw had created dramatic impact trauma without breaking his spine or crushing internal organs. The facial strike had shattered his protective plating while leaving his brain and major blood vessels intact. This was not random violence or even amateur fighting. Someone with extensive knowledge of Vorthon anatomy had deliberately chosen each impact point to create specific types of damage. Dr. Theis had seen combat injuries during her time with the Galactic Defense. Force and this level of tactical precision reminded her of Special Forces training rather than student violence. As she worked to reconstruct Jin Woo's facial structure, Dr. Theis ran detailed scans to understand the full extent of his injuries. The more she examined the damage, the more impressed she became with the attacker's skill and restraint. Jin Woo would recover completely within a few weeks, but the psychological impact would likely last much longer than the physical healing. Word of Jin Woo's hospitalization spread through the student body faster than emergency response protocols. Students gathered in small groups throughout the academy discussing what could have happened to the seemingly invincible Vorthon noble. Some whispered about equipment accidents or structural failures, but most suspected that someone had finally stood up to the infamous bully. When the truth began to emerge, the reaction was explosive. The quiet human girl who barely spoke in class had single-handedly destroyed Jin Woo in less than 3 seconds. Students who had cowered before the crystalline warrior now looked at Mira with expressions of amazement and barely concealed fear. The impossible had happened, and nothing would ever be the same. Professor Kale was summoned to review the security footage from the practice room, and what he saw forced him to completely reevaluate everything he thought he knew about humans. Mira's movements were not just fast, they were strategically perfect. Every action served multiple purposes, and every strike exploited specific vulnerabilities in Vorthan physiology. The professor had been teaching for decades and had seen students from hundreds of different species demonstrate their natural abilities. But he had never witnessed anything like the combination of speed, precision, and tactical knowledge that Mira had displayed. This was not beginner's luck or primitive instinct. This was the product of sophisticated training and genetic advantages he did not understand. That evening, Professor Kale accessed the classified military databases that he had clearance for as a former galactic defense instructor. He began researching Earth more thoroughly, hoping to understand what kind of world could produce beings with such devastating combat abilities. What he discovered made his spine chill with a mixture of awe and terror. Earth was not just any death world, it was possibly the most dangerous planet in known galactic space. The initial survey reports described a world where evolution had created the perfect predator species disguised as harmless social creatures. Humans looked weak and vulnerable, but appearances were completely deceiving when it came to their actual capabilities. The planet itself was a nightmare of constant change and destruction. Massive storms that could level cities appeared without warning. Earthquakes split continents apart, and volcanic eruptions blocked out the sun for years at a time. The temperature varied so wildly that most galactic species would die within hours of exposure to Earth's normal weather patterns. But the environmental dangers were nothing compared to the biological threats. Earth was filled with creatures that would be classified as extremely dangerous predators on any civilized world. Humans shared their planet with massive carnivores that could crush bones with their jaws and venomous creatures whose toxins could kill within minutes. Yet somehow, humans had not only survived, but thrived in this environment. The most terrifying discovery was humanity's capacity for organized violence. Humans were one of the few species that regularly fought wars against their own kind, constantly developing new and more effective ways to destroy each other. Their entire culture was built around controlled conflict, from their sports to their entertainment to their business practices. They had weaponized everything from simple tools to the fundamental forces of the universe. Their military history was a catalog of innovative destruction techniques and tactical innovations that had allowed smaller forces to defeat much larger enemies. They studied war the same way other species studied art or philosophy, as a complex discipline worthy of lifelong dedication. Professor Kale realized that humans had evolved under pressure that would have destroyed most other species. They had survived ice ages that lasted thousands of years. They had endured asteroid impacts that blocked out the sun. They had lived through supervolcanic eruptions and global pandemics that killed most other life on their planet. Every human alive was descended from the survivors of these catastrophic events. They carried in their genes the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of successful adaptation to impossible circumstances. They were living weapons wrapped in soft skin and friendly social behaviors that made them seem harmless to casual observation. The implications were staggering. Mira was not an unusual human, she was completely typical. Every member of her species carried within them the same genetic legacy of survival against impossible odds. They were all potential warriors, trained by the most brutal natural selection process in the galaxy and disguised as peaceful academic students. Professor Kyle began to understand why the initial contact reports had classified humans as a potential threat species despite their apparently primitive technology. It was not their tools or weapons that made them dangerous. It was their fundamental nature as adaptive predators who could learn and improvise faster than any other known species. The Galactic Academy had just admitted a member of the most dangerous warrior race ever discovered, and nobody had bothered to provide proper warnings or safety protocols. Mira walked among them with the casual friendliness of someone who had never encountered a threat she could not handle. Because on Earth everything was a potential threat, and humans had learned to deal with them all. as Professor Kale compiled. His research, he began to draft a report that would change how the entire galaxy viewed humanity. The small, quiet species from the obscure Death World was about to be recognized as one of the most formidable civilizations in known space. Jin Woo's broken face was just the beginning of a much larger revelation about human capabilities. The other students continued to whisper and speculate about what had happened in the practice room. Some were afraid of Mira, now keeping their distance and speaking in hushed tones when she was nearby. Others were fascinated by her abilities, asking endless questions about human culture and capabilities that she answered with patient politeness. Few students, mostly those who had been victims of Jin Woo's bullying, looked at Mira with something approaching worship. She had done what none of them had ever dared to attempt, and she had made it look effortless. The impossible victory over their tormentor had given them hope that bullies could be stopped and that strength did not always belong to the largest and most aggressive students. Mira herself seemed largely unaffected by the attention and speculation surrounding her. She continued attending classes, studying diligently and participating in group projects with the same quiet competence she had always shown. If anything, she seemed more relaxed now that Jin Woo was no longer harassing her on a daily basis. Jin Woo spent the next 2 weeks in the Medical Reconstruction Center, having his facial structure rebuilt piece by piece. Dr. Theis worked carefully with synthetic materials and biographs to restore his appearance, but the psychological damage would take much longer to heal than the physical injuries. When he looked in the mirror, he could see the thin lines where his natural crystal had been replaced with artificial substitutes. The proud Vorthan noble who had strutted through academy, corridors intimidating other students, was gone forever. In his place was someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and gave Mira a wide berth whenever their paths crossed in the hallways. His friends Tai Min and Hyeon Soo had abandoned him after news of his defeat spread through the student body, bringing shame to his family name. The other students' attitudes toward Mira had shifted dramatically since the incident. Some maintained their distance, keeping conversations polite but brief whenever they had to interact with her in class or group projects. They spoke in hushed whispers when she was nearby, as if afraid that raising their voices might somehow provoke her into violence. Others were fascinated by her abilities and peppered her with endless questions about human culture and combat training. They wanted to understand how someone who looked so harmless could be so devastatingly effective in a fight. Mira answered their questions with patient politeness, but she never went into great detail about her capabilities or training background. Small group of students, mostly those who had been victims of Jin Woo's bullying campaign, looked at Mira with something approaching hero worship. She had accomplished what none of them had ever dared to attempt, and she had made it look effortless. Her victory over their tormentor had given them hope that strength did not always belong to the biggest and most aggressive beings. During a group exercise in tactical analysis, Mira's unique perspective proved invaluable to her study team. While other species approached problems through individual strength or technological superiority, she thought in terms of adaptation and resource management. Her strategies were unconventional but devastatingly effective when tested in simulation environments. One of her teammates was a peaceful Kepler herbivore named So-Jin, who had been particularly interested in learning about human approaches to problem solving. The furry creature was naturally curious and had none of the fear that seemed to affect some of the other students when they interacted with Mira. So Jin asked carefully chosen questions during their study sessions, trying to understand how humans had developed such effective survival strategies. Mira seemed to enjoy having someone genuinely interested in her background, rather than just afraid of her abilities. She began sharing stories about human history and culture that amazed her study group. Humans do not fight fair, she explained during one particularly engaging discussion. We fight to win, and we use whatever advantages we can find. When you are small and weak compared to everything else on your planet, you learn to use your brain and your tools and your environment. You learn to turn your enemy's strengths against them. The other students listened with growing fascination as Mi-Ra described human military history. She told them about battles where smaller human forces had defeated enemies 10 times their size through superior tactics and psychological warfare. She explained how humans had learned to use terrain weather and timing to overcome opponents with better weapons and armor. Her stories included examples of human armies that had marched through impossible conditions to achieve surprise attacks. She described siege warfare, where human engineers had built incredible machines to overcome seemingly impregnable fortifications. She talked about naval battles where human captains had used wind and current to outmaneuver larger enemy fleets. Jinwoo spent 2 weeks in medical reconstruction, his face rebuilt with synthetic materials and biografts. When he finally returned to classes, he was a changed being. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and gave Mi-Ra a wide berth whenever their paths crossed. The other students' attitudes toward Mi-Ra shifted dramatically. Some were afraid, keeping their distance and speaking in hushed tones when she was nearby. Others were fascinated, asking endless questions about human culture and capabilities. A few, mostly those who had been victims of Jinwoo's bullying, looked at her with something approaching worship. Mi-Ra herself seemed largely unaffected by the attention. She continued attending classes, studying diligently, and participating in group projects with the same quiet competence she had always shown. If anything, she seemed more relaxed now that Jinwoo was no longer harassing her. During a group exercise, in tactical analysis, Mi-Ra's human perspective proved invaluable. While other species approached problems through individual strength or technological superiority, she thought in terms of adaptation and resource management. Her strategies were unconventional but devastatingly effective. Humans don't fight fair, she explained to her study group. We fight to win. When you're small and weak compared to everything else on your planet, you learn to use your brain, your tools, and your environment. You learn to turn your enemy's strengths against them. The other students listened with rapt attention as she described human military history, their eyes widening at tales of battles won through superior strategy rather than superior force. Stories of humans defeating enemies 10 times their size through clever tactics, psychological warfare, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. One student, a peaceful Kepler herbivore named So-Jin, asked hesitantly, "Are all humans warriors, like you?" Mi-Ra considered the question seriously. "Not exactly, but we're all survivors. Every human alive today is descended from the ones who were smart enough, tough enough, and determined enough to live through everything our world threw at them. We carry that legacy in our genes." The implications were staggering. Humans weren't just individuals, they were the products of the most brutal natural selection process in the galaxy. Part 6. Understanding As. The semester progressed. Mi-Ra became something of a legend at the academy. Students would point her out in the corridors, whispering stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed she had defeated 10 opponents simultaneously. Others insisted she could kill with a single touch. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment. Jinwoo, meanwhile, had become an object lesson in the dangers of underestimating humans. His friends abandoned him, his family expressed shame at his defeat by a primitive species, and his confidence never fully recovered. He spent his remaining time at the academy in relative obscurity, a former bully brought low by his own arrogance. Professor Kale used the incident as a teaching moment, explaining to his classes how humans represented a completely different approach to survival and development. Most species evolved in relatively stable environments, developing specialized traits for specific niches. Humans evolved in chaos, becoming generalists capable of adapting to almost any situation. Look at their bodies, he explained during one lecture. No natural weapons, no armor, no environmental specializations. Yet they've conquered their entire planet and are rapidly expanding into space. They did it through intelligence, cooperation, and an almost supernatural ability to solve problems under pressure. Mira herself gave a presentation about Earth that left the entire class stunned. She described hurricanes that could level cities, earthquakes that split continents, and temperature variations that would kill most galactic species instantly. She talked about animals that humans casually coexisted with, creatures that would be classified as extremely dangerous predators on any civilized world. "We swim in oceans filled with predators," she said matter-of-factly. "We climb mountains that could freeze or crush us. We live alongside creatures that could kill us easily, and we've learned to respect them rather than fear them. Earth taught us that survival isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being smart enough to know when to fight, when to run, and when to adapt." The final revelation came when Mira mentioned that she had never received formal combat training. Everything she had done to Jin Woo came from basic self-defense classes that most human children learned for protection against their own kind. She wasn't a warrior or a soldier, just an ordinary college student who happened to come from a world where ordinary meant extraordinary by galactic standards. As the semester ended, the Academy quietly updated its admission policies for Deathworld, species. Future human students would come with detailed briefings about their capabilities and appropriate precautions. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about judging species by their appearance rather than their origins. Mira graduated with honors and returned to Earth, leaving behind a legacy that would influence Academy policy for generations. Jin Woo eventually recovered physically, though he never again underestimated an opponent based on their appearance. The quiet human girl had taught them all that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look like a threat. In the end, it wasn't really a story about violence or revenge. It was about respect, understanding, and the dangerous folly of assuming that peaceful means weak. Mira had never wanted to hurt anyone, but when pushed too far, she had responded with the instinctive efficiency of a species that had earned its place at the top of one of the galaxy's most hostile worlds. The galaxy was a little wiser for the lesson, even if it came at the cost of Jin Woo's facial reconstruction.